All right, well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. We're on Chapter 5, Outer Darkness, and let me go ahead and minimize the Zoom the rest of the way so we can get it off of our screen.
Okay.
If there's anybody out there on Zoom that's not seeing the picture, let me know. I think Jonathan said he could see it, so hopefully we're okay. So this is the scripture that she opens with in chapter 5, and I've added a little bit more to it just to kind of get the context. And the yellow is what she's got in the book. And so this is from Matthew, from the parable of the talents. And you remember there was one servant who got just one talent. Instead of investing it, he buried it. And so this was what Jesus, or what the master pronounced on the worthless slave. I preached a sermon on this in the last year. I kind of took a little bit different view of it, which not everybody maybe agreed with, but I wondered if maybe the servant was not quite as bad a person as what Matthew was making out. So anyway, the master said, instructed, I guess, his other servants, take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. And as for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, all my life, I have been wondering, what does gnashing of teeth mean? I'm going to lower the lights just a little bit in here so we can see the screen better.
I always thought it was like grinding when you get mad and you're
like grinding your teeth in your sleep and you're not even aware of it until the dentist tells you.
Well, I don't know why at my age I failed to look that up on the internet before today, but Jim and others have said grinding their teeth, and that's exactly correct. That's what gnashing of teeth refers to. All my life, I had this in my mind as gnashing of teeth, but apparently that's not the case. So, all right. So Jim was just talking a minute ago before we actually started here about people who believe in hell, and so she kind of begins the chapter with a rundown of what different religious groups believe, and I thought it was interesting. Overall, Americans, about 58%, or a little over half, believe in a literal place called hell. Evangelical Protestants have the highest rate of belief in hell. That's 82%. That's a part of the evangelical theology, so not too surprising. I guess maybe what's more surprising to me is that there are 18% of evangelicals out there who don't believe in hell, rather than that there are 82% who do. For Muslims, 76% believe in hell. Other Christians, Catholics included, Catholics and other Protestant denominations, 59 to 63%. Jewish, only 22%. And Jim's question was, why the author said, of course, as a Jewish person, why the Jews didn't believe in hell. And we'll kind of go into that a little bit today.
Isn't that Americans about the average if they say believe in Jesus?
I don't know. It's a good question. I would think that belief in Jesus would be higher because I know a lot of people who believe in Jesus who don't believe in hell. But I don't know. I don't have numbers, any data for that. But I thought it was interesting that Jehovah's Witnesses, only 7%, actually believe in a literal hell. And I had to go back and look up a little bit about Jehovah's Witnesses' belief. And they, in the afterlife, I think what's that? They don't believe in the afterlife. Well, yeah, they believe in some people are going to be saved and everybody else is just going to kind of, 122,000 or something like that. But anyway, they don't have a strong belief in hell, which I didn't know that until I looked that up. One of the things that she kind of does is, without saying so, is she traces the historical evolution of the belief in hell. in the Bible. And so, Jim, this is maybe the answer to your question. There is not as much focus in the Old Testament on hell. Amy-Jill Levine says this is because Israel was primarily concerned with living rather than with death, and so I guess that's a good reason. And the Jews, the ancient Hebrews, believed that all the souls, everybody, after they die, go to a place called SHEOL, or Abaddon. And this is not really a hell as we think of it, as a hellfire and damnation and burning and pain and so forth. This is just kind of a shadowy half-life away from God, is the way I think she described it. In the early Greek, their beliefs, the translators used the term Hades. And I guess when they did the first translation of the Bible into English, which was the King James Version, the translators, every time they saw the word Sheol in the Old Testament, they translated it as hell. So if you're talking about references to hell in the Bible, yes, in the King James Version that would be true, but I think she's trying to point out it's kind of a mistranslation because they're really talking about the Hebrew version of hell, or what they call Sheol. And then I did a little research in this Abaddon, which I'd never heard of before, is similar to Sheol, but it seems to have a little more emphasis on destruction and suffering involved. So that, I don't know if that was a cultural thing, depending on which part of Palestine you lived in or what. But I thought that was interesting. So in Sheol, the emphasis was less on suffering and punishment, and it was more on seeing it as an opportunity for God to rescue his people who were there, who were in this kind of netherworld, this death world. And if you are a Christian and you're looking at Psalm 23, and you read, "Though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me," we would interpret that, I think we would interpret that, if you have a different way of looking at it, tell me, but I would interpret that as in my life. You know, if I'm a soldier, I remember my father telling the testimony of being in Vietnam, and this scripture got him through his year in Vietnam, because he felt like he was in the valley of death as a helicopter pilot, and yet he really had no fear. That was his testimony. But if you were a Hebrew in the Old Testament reading Psalm 23, and you read, "I walk through the valley of death," you would think of somebody who has gone on from this life into Sheol. And yet there's no fear, because at some point God is going to rescue those souls. And so there's a more positive spin on it, I guess you would say. Another Old Testament term for hell was Gehenna, and that's from the Hebrew word Guy, and a name, Hinnom. That's Guy means valley, and Hinnom is the guy who owned the property, the person who owned the valley. So it was the valley of Hinnom.
I don't want to
So this is a picture of the Valley of Hinnom today. It's actually, picturesque and got some trees. There are graves there. There are old ancient burial sites. There's some interesting stories about the Valley of Hinnom. One that's true is probably true. That they believed it was also a site for cremations, and so it may have been the fires from the cremations that people started to associate fire and burning with this sense of hell or with afterlife. There's another story that I've read in more than one commentary, probably in several commentaries, that the reason hell became associated with the Valley of Hinnom was because this was where allegedly the people of Jerusalem threw their trash and also cadavers, people who were too poor to be buried in a nice tomb like this. And so the story goes that they kept the fires burning constantly to burn the trash and to burn the cadavers and kind of control the smell. And you know that once you start a fire in a big trash heap, it burns sometimes for years and years and years. But archaeologists have determined that there's no evidence for that having ever happened. They found the crematories, but there's no evidence of trash being there or fires that went on for decades or even centuries. So that's a story, but the crematory part is probably true. All right, I'm going to go ahead and play the video now, because I want you all to hear what her beliefs are before we go on any farther. And then there's a little story that she tells at the end when her mom passed away. And I was really touched by that, and I wanted to kind of get that into the discussion before we.
I've had a number of students, a number of people who write to me, a number of people who have sent me emails, all concerned about hell. Am I good enough? What will happen at the final judgment? I've had some doubts about Jesus. Am I damned? This is not a healthy way of having faith. Because if faith means I'm acting out of fear, then it means you're not acting out of love. And if we have the idea of God as this angry, wrathful, lightning bolt hurling, horrible God, then how can we talk about a God of love and of grace and compassion? When I was growing up in the synagogue, I don't think I ever heard anything about hell, and I vaguely heard about the Satan in the book of Job, but there wasn't a sense of following out of fear. There was always a sense of following God from love, because that's how we got the covenant, the commandments in the first place. But for a number of my students, that fear of hell and the fear of Satan is real. So when Jesus talks about being thrown into the outer darkness where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth, or the fiery pit, how are we to understand his words? And how did those words make sense in the context of the proclamation of a God of love rather than a God of eternal torture? Sometimes I want to believe in hell because there are people I want to put there. But then I have a second thought that no, clearly I can be more compassionate than that, because even as much as certain people I very, very much dislike, the idea of that person suffering in eternal torture just doesn't work for me. And the historian in me also wonders about this idea of eternal torture, as we would have, for example, in Dante's Inferno, where Cassius and Brutus and Judas Iscariot are in the pit of hell being gnawed by Satan. It's an interesting image. But I'm not sure that's what Jesus was talking about. That outer darkness where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth, that's not eternal torture. That is rather oblivion. Do we want to be remembered for eternal life and bliss and happiness? Or do we take it all in this world and then there's nothing in the next? I'm not afraid of hell, and I don't really believe in it. And sometimes I wonder, what kind of people believe in a God that would torture God's own children forever? That rich young ruler who walked away from Jesus didn't quite follow the gospel then, but Jesus still loved him. And when we stray, we are still children of God, and a good father does not want eternal torture for the people who are in his image and likeness. In the scriptures of Israel, we don't have hell. Let's back that up. We do if we're reading from the King James Version, where every time the mention of Gan Hinnom, the Hinnom Valley shows up, it gets translated as hell. Hell is there depending upon your translator. We have rather multiple references to something called Sheol, which means the pit or the abyss. But frequently when Sheol is mentioned, it's mentioned in order to show us that God rescues us from Sheol. God rescues us from the pit. So that the image of God we have is not one who condemns people to hell or condemns people even to oblivion, but a God who rescues us. And then how do we live on? We don't fear death, but we live on through the reputation that we've made, the good works that we've done, the children we've either created or influenced or helped. And our memories are retained by our community and by our family. So there's no eternal death. There's an ongoing life. And for the Jewish tradition, as it developed by the first century, there's not only ongoing life in your children and in your name, there is indeed resurrection from the dead and final judgment. The New Testament, for the most part, doesn't have the hell that we think about today popularly, people burning in fiery pits forever and ever. Even when you get to the book of Revelation, which has lots of really horrible images to it, at the end of the book, even death is swallowed up. Again, not permanent torture, but oblivion. Something else worth noting. Take those threats as something that's real. There is, for the text, a final judgment. And in order to have a final judgment, there has to be some sort of justice. We have in the Gospel of Luke a parable called the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And Lazarus, poor, diseased, unable to walk, ill-treated, finds himself in the bosom of Abraham, which is the heavenly high rent district. And the rich man who ignored poor Lazarus finds himself in a fiery pit. But is that the end of the story? Jesus hasn't died yet. This is a story he's told. There is no final judgment yet. Perhaps people in antiquity had a sense of what we might call purgatory. The Jewish tradition has a sense of about 11 months of getting everything fixed, recognizing what you have done wrong, atoning for it, which is a personal form of torture because you recognize your guilt and you acknowledge it. But there's no eternal hell, not in Paul, not in the book of Revelation, and not on the lips of Jesus. People had options for what happens to us when we die. In the first century, there were multiple options. There was eternal life as if your spirit survives, but your body simply decays. There was transmigration of souls, so your personality, your who you are, could be transferred into somebody else. Herod Antipas wonders about Jesus. Could this be John the Baptist raised from the dead? Reincarnation or karma. But the dominant view in first century Judaism in the land of Israel was resurrection of the dead, and that was a view promulgated by the Pharisees. Why? Because who you are has something to do with your body. Can't in Judaism separate body and soul. They come together. Why? Because the body is in the image and likeness of God. So there has to be a resurrection of the dead. And in fact, you enact who you are in your body by what you eat, by what you wear, by whom you touch, by what you look like. Everyone stamped in the image and likeness, but everyone as an individual. So you come back in the body, but it's a body that's perfected, as Paul would put it. It's a spiritual body. It's one that does not suffer decay, that does not suffer disease, that does not suffer hunger, and in fact, as I can understand it, looks even more fabulous than I do with all this makeup on. Something to look forward to. The Jewish tradition today has multiple views about what happens to us when we die. In the conservative movement and Orthodoxy, resurrection of the dead is still on the books, and we pray in the daily liturgy to God, Mechaye HaMetim, who gives life to the dead. The Reform movement in Judaism, and it's Reform, not Reformed, that would be Presbyterians. The Reform movement actually changed the liturgy, so God is acclaimed as the one, Mechaye HaKol, who gives life to all. But resurrection of the dead is part of my tradition. I'm not really sure today if I actually believe in it, but here's a story in which I express my belief. Years ago, when my mom was dying, my husband and I were called by family members, your mom is really sick, you need to come home. So we left Philadelphia and we went to New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is where I was born, where my mom was born. My mom was in St. Luke's Hospital, where I was a candy striper, a youth worker. So we get to the hospital, it's fairly late at night, we go to intake, and I say to the intake charge nurse, I'm Dr. Levine from Philadelphia, this is my husband, Dr. Geller. We didn't quite note that we were PhDs in religion, we didn't think that was terribly important. They did check our IDs. I said, I'm Ann Levine's daughter, she's here in intensive care, can I see her? And they said, well, it's really after hours. I said, yes, but I'm Dr. Levine from Philadelphia, and we just came in. And they were gracious enough. They escorted us, of course, to see my mom. My mom was 80. She was in stage 4 cancer. She had emphysema. God bless her. She smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day. So we eventually get her out of intensive care. She's in a room. She had a do not resuscitate. She did not want to be kept alive by extraordinary measures. And she was on a morphine drip, so she was asleep most of the time. And my husband and I stayed in her room. One of us sat on the bed, and the other one sat on the one chair that was in the room. And she opened her eyes. I'm sitting on the bed. And she looked at me, completely lucid. And she said, what's going to happen to me when I die? And I looked at her, and I said, Mommy? I said, Mommy, you'll see Daddy, who had died years before. And my mother says to me, I look like hell. And I said to her, Mom, yeah, you're 80, you have stage 4 cancer, your teeth aren't in, you've looked better. But when you see Daddy, you will look as beautiful as you did on the day you got married. And my mother says to me, how do you know this? And I said, Mommy, I have a PhD in religion. I know these things. And she smiled at me. She closed her eyes. And my husband looked at me. He just stared at me. A little bit of time goes by. And then he says to me, you don't believe that. I'm not even sure you believe in God, but I'm pretty sure you don't believe that. And I looked at him and I said, Jay, I wasn't lying to my mother. I believed everything that I said. And then the sound went off, and my mother died. And what I said to her was true.
So anyway, I'm going to go back to kind of tracing the evolution of belief in hell from the Old Testament to the New Testament. I'll just kind of try to zip through these slides, and then we'll have some discussion. So the first time that hell, I think, is actually mentioned in the Old Testament in the sense of what we're thinking about, this would be from Isaiah 26, and this is actually talking about being resurrected from the dead, from SHEOL. And Isaiah, and by the way, this chapter is one of the chapters that pretty clearly was probably written during the Babylonian period. This whole chapter, 26 Isaiah, is a hymn. It's a liturgical device that been worshipped by the Jewish people in Babylon. And so this part says, but your dead will live, their bodies will rise, those who live in the dust will wake up and shout for joy, and for your dew is like the dew of the dawn, and the earth will give birth to the dead. So the earth is going to give up its dead. And if you go and read the entire chapter, the 26th chapter of Isaiah, it's like a Jewish version of the song, We Are the Champions. It's all the good things that are going to happen to God's people eventually when God rescues them from Sheol, which is what Isaiah was talking about here. And then a little farther on, so now we're in the 2nd century BCE. This is from Daniel chapter 12. Kind of see the progression of development of some of the beliefs. At that time, Daniel says, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise, and there shall be a time of anguish such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So now we have kind of a reward and punishment situation that is entering into the Jewish belief system. Some will be resurrected to everlasting life, what we would think of as heaven or eternity, and others to live the remainder of their life in shame and everlasting contempt. This has more to do with the oblivion that Amy-Jill Levine was talking about, not necessarily burning in hellfire, but people who will be remembered by their offspring and others as in very negative ways. So it's kind of this sense of it's not necessarily maybe about the burning, it's about people's memory of you if you weren't a very good person.
I would think it would also be your personal memories of what you did and why you're not up there with God enjoying life.
Yeah. Well, she talked about that too, that making atonement, is kind of a personal hell, which very well could go along with that. I think you're right. And so then after Daniel, we have what's called the Maccabean period. That's the period where the Seleucids from the north were coming down and oppressing the Hebrews, and the Maccabeans, there was a revolt, and they were kind of like the Ukrainians and the Russians, the little guys against the big guys, and the Maccabeans had some successes. And so the writing during this period began to be very apocalyptic. Lots of references to judgment and punishment, but not for everybody, but specifically for their enemies. They wanted the Seleucids to go to hell. Kind of like Amy-Jill Levine talked about. There's some people we think, probably deserve that. And one of these writings was the book of Daniel. Then there was this early biblical consideration of the possibility of resurrection, and she mentioned in her little talk that by the first century, which was the time of Jesus, the Pharisees were strongly preaching the notion of resurrection. And so she says, this is her words, with the idea of resurrection came concepts of final judgment and final sentences for wrongdoing. So if people are going to be preserved for eternity, then, as the Book of Mormon used to say, there has to be an opposition in all things. There has to be a punishment side. There have to be some people who don't make it into that level. And I like her terminology. It's almost medical terms here. She calls it post-mortem judgment. Post-mortem judgment that has to take place. So these are not books in the Bible. Maccabees is from the Apocrypha, and First Enoch is another book that didn't make the cut into the Old Testament. So from 4 Maccabees, justice has laid up for you intense and eternal fire and tortures, and these throughout all time will never let you go. So now we have the introduction, 100 years ago before Christ, of this notion of, hell's going to be a painful place to spend eternity. But again, the inference here was that this is what's going to happen to the enemies of the Hebrews, not necessarily to, Hebrews that did bad things, but to the Seleucids. And then First Enoch, it kind of develops a little farther. So I saw the angel of the plague cooperating and preparing all the chains of Satan. And the chains were being prepared for the kings and the potentates of the earth, that they might be destroyed thereby. So very clearly stating now who this painful time in eternity is intended for. It's for the bad kings that mistreated the people. So by the time of Jesus, Levine says that the idea that the righteous would be rewarded and the wicked punished was a view firmly entrenched, save perhaps for the Sadducees. And the Sadducees, in opposition to the Pharisees, were a group that didn't accept that there would be a resurrection. Probably all heard that before. So Jesus, in his statements, is clearly talking about rewards and punishments. And so what happens to the wicked? Are they annihilated? Do they go through eternity with a bad reputation? Is there eternal punishment? And Levine says that how we read the New Testament depends more on our own views of justice or vengeance rather than maybe what Jesus might have intended or the writers of the New Testament might have intended when they recorded these things. And then she said, in her little talk, Paul never mentions it, what Paul does say, and this is in 1 Thessalonians, and she points out this was written probably just 10 or 15 years after Jesus, so it's almost contemporaneous to Jesus. Jesus rescues us from the wrath that is coming. Otherwise, Paul does not mention hell or any notions of eternal punishment in his letters. And then this is from the book of Revelation, and she talked about how there are some statements in Revelation. The final statement was, death is overcome by God. But this is one. Those that worship the beast will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. That's the second death. I guess what seems a little morbid to me about this statement is not only are they being punished, but it's being done in the presence of the angels and the presence of Jesus. As like, is this, I don't know whether to take this as they're observing this, like the old Roman Colosseum where they watch the centurions battle to the death or be killed by the lions or whatever. Or is it like somebody just said a few minutes ago, the people who are in this condition can see, what a positive situation it would be like to be, in eternity with God and feel badly about that. I really don't know where the scripture is going with that, but that was interesting. And then there are also stories of reward and punishment that came from the Greek and Roman stories about Hades and the Elysian fields. Have you all heard about the Elysian fields? So this is Hades, who was the god of the underworld. And a lot of the statues and pictures that I found, he has this three-headed dog. Sometimes he has three dogs. But I thought it was interesting that, there's a three-headed dog sitting by the throne of Hades in his underworld. And there was a story, that part of the myth about Hades was he was lonely and he wanted a wife. And so Zeus said, well, go kidnap Persephone. And so he went up to Earth and he kidnapped Persephone and took her down to hell with him. And there are pictures of her sitting by him on the throne, and she's just absolutely miserable that she has to spend her life in Hades. And then I was thinking immediately when I read about the Elysian fields, I love this movie. Nadine always kind of kids me because every time I see it's on, I have to stop and watch it for a little while. But Gladiator, at the end of the movie, when he has killed the emperor in the Colosseum, but he's also suffered a mortal wound, and so as he's passing from this life into the next life, and here he is in the Elysian fields, a beautiful meadow with wheat growing, and can't hardly see them, but down the road, his wife and son who were killed by the emperor are coming to him to join him in paradise. And so that's, to me, that's just a very positive image. And then that's the Elysian fields. That's exactly what the Romans would have believed.
That's the only thing I thought of instead of Elysium.
Oh, did you? Yeah. So let's just kind of quickly go down through Jesus' sayings about hell. Most of the, in fact, I think all of these are from Matthew. And then you'll have to, as she said, you have to kind of make your own determination of what Jesus was talking about according to how you believe, how you feel about this. So he's talking about, murder is bad. This is the Sermon on the Mount. But it's just as bad to be angry with somebody. And even calling somebody a fool makes one liable to hell. That sounds like a very stringent punishment to me because we've all been angry at times, right? So how do we rationalize or try to figure out what Jesus meant there? And then he's talking about adultery, and he said, if you're going to commit adultery, that's bad, but it's just as bad to look on a woman and have lust in your heart, Jimmy Carter kind of a thing. And he said, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. It's better to lose your eye than go to hell for unplanned thoughts. Levine calls this a verbal cold shower. kind of getting the men back on track again. Then he threatens the scribes and Pharisees with hell or oblivion. That happens probably more than once. He talks about outer darkness, and she likens that to a black hole in space, where the darkness is a result of everything just gets sucked into it because it's so powerful. Hadn't thought of that analogy or heard that before, but thought it was interesting. What's that?
I said I thought that was interesting too because I got the devil. So blacker than black.
Really? Okay.
So it's sort of like
So not red. Not red.
not red.
Okay. I wonder where the red came from. Dante or something.
Okay.
And then she talks about the first will be last and the last will be first, and that's kind of a hell in itself because here you go through life. I'm a good Hebrew. I'm righteous, and I'm wealthy and doing all the things that I think are right. And then it turns out that in the end, it's the people who were the have-nots that get to go first. And be in paradise. So those who were last in this life are rewarded, those who were first will be punished, and not everyone finds a heavenly reward. And Matthew 10 talks about the end of the age. The angels will separate the evil from the righteous and throw the evil into the furnace of fire like the chaff. And then there's the parable of the slave who owed money to the master, and the master forgave him, but the slave had a debtor and didn't forgive him, and so the master got upset and sentenced the slave to go to hell, so he didn't turn out so well. We have the parable of the man who came to the feast without the right attire on. He wasn't dressed properly. He got thrown into outer darkness. We have the parable of the church leaders who mistreated others and got cut into pieces and put with the hypocrites, where there was wailing and gnashing of teeth. This is all in Matthew. I think Matthew had he wrote a lot about hell.
Maybe he had a rough upbringing as a child.
And then there's the parable of the sheep and the goats are sent to eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. I like goats. What did they do? All right, and then I wanted to include the Latter-day Saint perspective. So I wanted to see how many of you remembered these teachings. I was brought up on this. I know we've mentioned the three glories, that come from the 76th section of the Doctrine and Covenants. And so this is modern Latter-day Saint perspective. So if you talk to most Mormons, they would say that they would agree with this. And it starts with a premortal existence, and then we come to this earth. My grandmother was very in tune with these stories. I remember her talking to me all the time about this. And she believed in a pre-existence, and she believed in predestination. And I could never figure out until I saw this little diagram here. If we lived in the pre-existence with God, why don't we remember it? That was always my kid question. Grandma, why don't I remember that? Well, Mormons believe that there's this veil of forgetfulness that was cast over us when we came to this earth, so that we intentionally would not recall the time before the pre-existence, or the time in the pre-existence. Now, so then we have our life on earth, and we pass away, and we go to the spirit world, and then there's a resurrection, and then there's a final judgment. So the final judgment doesn't take place until everybody is first resurrected. And in Latter-day Saint theology, we know about the three kingdoms. The celestial kingdom, those are the ones who actually get to be with the Lamb, actually get to be with Jesus and God. The terrestrial kingdom is a glory, but it's not quite as good, and God's not present with you. I'm not sure who is with you in that. And then there's the celestial kingdom. And again, I always wondered about terminology. I know what celestial means. That's the sky and the stars. Terrestrial is earth. But what is telestial? Is that actually a word? Does anybody know? Is that? Yeah, it's actually, my research said that it comes from tele, which means perfect. So I thought, well, why would telestial be perfect if the perfect people are up in the celestial kingdom? Yeah.
Pretty small.
Yeah, but there is, outside of Latter-day Saintism, there is no real meaning for this word other than it's the third glory, how they've defined it. And so the people, except for the sons of perdition, the Latter-day Saint Church believes that all people will receive some level of glory. No sin is unforgivable because we go through this life with an incomplete knowledge about God, so we can't be held completely accountable until the very end. And so those in the telestial glory are actually people that we would say probably went to hell. These are the dishonest, the liars, the adulterers, the sorcerers, sorry, Harry Potter, and the whoremongers. And the murderers in the telestial kingdom. So the belief is that even the worst that God is going to do to us is still better than maybe what we deserve. It's still glorious. And then the people in the celestial and the people in the terrestrial, see how the people in the highest kingdom get to be with God, and they're kind of jealous of that. That's all in the 76th section of the Doctrine and Covenants. So kind of interesting stuff there. And then this final judgment, there are some who go to outer darkness. Who are those folks? Those are the sons of perdition. Those are the ones who chose intentionally to follow Saint and then are cast into outer darkness. So those are people in apostasy. So those are only folks, it doesn't matter what they've done, if they choose to not believe in God, then they go to outer darkness. And yes, okay, and so this is interesting, I found this. There are no daughters of perdition because the Latter-day Saint President Joseph F. Smith declared in 1903 that no woman would follow Satan.
That is true.
But not all the members of the Latter-day Saint Church accept this as true. So I don't know, how many of you had this at some point in your upbringing?
Oh, yeah.
Before it? Yeah. Okay. I
That's
always
the
feel like
place where Jesus teaches. I mean,
Yeah,
that's the big
remember
argument.
that?
I used to
yeah.
have.
So that
We don't
happens.
teach it anymore.
Did you unplug people?
I remember my dad had instead of the slides.
It was the,
I think it's before the final
Workhouse.
judgment, after the resurrection,
It
before
was
the final
called
judgment.
something. What
it was
was it
called the
called?
workhouse.
It was called
Not-
prison house.
The what house?
Prison house.
Prison house?
I don't know.
Okay.
Workhouse,
That's what
prison house.
Yeah.
That was you go there for a while and come out.
Oh, even when I was like 20, I was getting into arguments with the people. Like what she was saying is like they would say, oh, we have to save these people and they're going to go to hell. And I said, don't worry, Jesus is going to teach them, before the final judgment day. I was never really worried that people weren't going to get a chance. That's kind of my
Yeah.
belief.
Why did we
system.
abandon this teaching? Because to me it makes sense rather than just say, here's heaven, here's hell. You either go here or you go here. And also, yeah,
I don't know. I mean, clearly the Latter-day Saint Church has not abandoned the teaching, but I don't know if there are still people in the community of Christ who teach that in their Sunday.
I was raised to believe that.
I see our church as letting people decide whether to believe it.
Yeah.
I mean, you can believe
Yeah.
that if that was your upbringing and that's what you choose to believe now, but there's so many different belief systems out there that I don't think our church says this is what you have to believe. I mean, somebody correct me if
I
I'm
don't.
wrong.
It's not. I don't believe it's in our statement of beliefs or anything.
No.
That brings up the fact that Joseph and his brother were contemplating about this, and they said the Spirit came over them, and this was revealed to them by the Lord. Now, are we to say that Joseph and Hiram were just telling a big fib, or do we believe that really happened to
Well,
Joseph and his brother?
Joseph also said he had a dream about polygamy, Jim. So there are some things that Joseph believed as a man and other things that he believed from God. And we have to choose now to discern what is truth and what is from Joseph as a man. That's what we have to do.
Well, I would just say that most of what I just presented on the previous slides is in the 76th section of the Doctrine and Covenants. That is still part of our Doctrine and Covenants. It has not been, relegated to the index or removed altogether. So I think the church probably, like Jane says, allows people to, form their beliefs about that, how they do it. And I don't have an answer for you, Jim. I'm sorry. I wish I did. But I haven't heard that preached in a long, long time. But
I was unaware that
a lot as a kid.
our church had sort of abandoned.
Well, it doesn't overtly teach it anymore.
I was going to say there's a difference between abandonment and not promoting it. I don't think we promote it. I don't know that we've abandoned it.
I think the church has chosen to not do it. Yeah, definitely true.
I mean, it's important to do what we're supposed to on the earth instead of being, if we do things because of where we're going after life, then are we really focused on
Well, and
to
she
get
talked.
accomplished here?
Amy-Jill talked about, are we practicing our religion out of fear or are we practicing out of love? That's a choice that has to be made.
To me, that was, I always thought, for me, as a kid, I can't remember a sermon about going to hell or all this stuff. My congregation, I didn't hear that ever. I can remember. And so I think her point was life now, living a loving life was what she heard. I think that's what I heard about was part of my
I'm not sure that I ever heard about punishment in this church. When I was young, I hung out with a lot of evangelical friends, so I heard it from them. And at that point in your life, you're kind of trying to figure out, well, is this right or not right? Or
I don't think I've ever heard of. I've heard one, hellfire and damnation.
Only one? I grew up in Mapleton. We had Raymond Lower. So
All right, one last scripture from Revelation. Blessed are those who wash their robes so that they will have the right to the tree of life and may enter the city by the gates. Outside of the dogs and the sorcerers and the fornicators and the murderers and the idolaters and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. So again, from Revelation, one final statement about that separation. All right, so let me ask you a few quick questions before we wrap up here. Thomas Aquinas, I guess, was the one who said that it increases our joy to see the wicked suffer. Is that a reason to believe in hell because you have people in your life that you'd like to see punished?
Did he say that or
Valdemar Putin, Joseph Stalin, and Adolf Hitler.
I can think of a lot of people, I'd say, and I've seen people write this on Facebook, former apostles. I hope so-and-so rots in hell, a really bad person.
Well, did Aquinas ask that as a question, or did he say it?
Well, I think he's asking it. Well, he stated it. I'm asking it as a question. I'm asking you, does it enhance your joy to think about the wicked suffering? Jeremy,
I think it's kind of a human thing.
Yeah.
I don't know about it increasing joy, but a lot of people have the thoughts.
It doesn't make us any better than they are the way watching them suffer.
My conception, hell is the outcome in Scripture, basically the complete separation from God. That's my two answers.
Yeah, and then she emphasizes that too as being maybe the type of oblivion that Jesus was talking about. Is salvation and damnation more important than sanctification in this world? What the rabbis said we should be working on.
Well, it seems to me like, most of the references to hell, like you said, is from Matthew. Maybe it was just, those people that were trying to get everybody else to get in line and, follow what I say, the churches. So they started bringing this up. It's just like your kids. Santa, you better be good because Santa's watching. Same thing. You better be good because, God's watching and you're going to go to hell if you don't shape up.
Well, there's a sanctification, living a saintly life.
And so is it better to follow God out of fear of hell and punishment, or as a response to God's grace?
Feeling like I did the fear thing for the first half of my life, and I don't now, I'd say I'd like God's grace then.
And then Levine says, people may want to hell because they cannot find justice in this world. Others may think this world is hell enough.
That's kind of like Lazarus.
Yeah.
God's grace. He was good.
All right, well, those are some questions you can think about this week. I need to save 5 minutes here to talk about upcoming. And then go back to page 124 and read what she has to say about constructing an image of God in our minds. Next week, chapter 6, Your Father the Devil, which sounds like an interesting chapter. Dennis has handed out a list of, did we end up with 4 books? 4 choices. 4 choices for our next book, because we have 2 more weeks on Amy-Jill Levine, and then we need to decide where we're going to go after that. And Dennis brought in a couple of the books here, so if you want to take a minute after class and look through those, see what you think. But come back prepared. Let's see, today's the 5th. I think you said we were going to come back and vote on the 12th.
No,
Right.
some people have voted.
Oh, we have some votes already? Okay.
I would like to say on this first one, there a correction that part 3 is not part of this first book. When Jonathan was cutting and pasting, I think.
Oh, okay.
That got left in.
So cross
Take out
out part
that.
3, our work ahead.
Yeah, that's a book that we want to be eliminated.
Okay. But anyway, so take a look at those. Some of these we need to probably get them ordered because they're no longer in print, and so we're going to have to look around a little bit to see if we can find some used copies or whatever. So if we can decide by next Sunday, I think that will be helpful. All right, questions?